Hi everyone, my name is Emily Finch. I'm the invasive species specialist for the Dubois, Daviess, and Martin County Soil and Water Conservation Districts. And given the prevalence of Japanese stiltgrass, invasive annual grass in our area, I thought that it would be a great idea to record this presentation for folks, which I originally put together for the Upper Midwest Invasive Species Conference. Stiltgrass can be a tricky invasive to manage, but unmanaged populations tend to spread very, very quickly. So hopefully this will provide some information for those of you that are struggling to contain this invasive. So just to clear some things up for those of you who might not be familiar, my position covers 3 counties in southwestern Indiana. And we were fortunate to have it because of a grant, the Clean Water Indiana grant, through the Indiana State Department of Agriculture funds the position. I work with 2 area cooperative invasive species management areas, as well as various invasive species managers, private landowners, foresters, which is part of where I have gotten a lot of this information. In particular, I would like to thank Ron Rathbone, who really helped when I was trying to compile some of the more specific control recommendations just with his observations in managing this invasive in southern Indiana. So Japanese stiltgrass is becoming a more common invasive in southern Indiana, but also just in general in the eastern United States. And its predicted future range, which the map is here courtesy of EdMap's website, is predicted to spread more within the Midwest. It's only in recent years that states like Michigan and Wisconsin have had confirmed stiltgrass populations there. And if for those of you who are not from our area in Indiana, if you look at the map on the left, that yellow star shows where I'm located here in Indiana. So Japanese stiltgrass, for those who aren't familiar, is an annual grass with alternate leaves. They're a little bit longer or a little bit shorter and wider, lance-shaped. And the real key characteristic to look for to distinguish Japanese stiltgrass from other species is if you look at a leaf, going down the middle of the leaf, slightly offset from the exact center, is this kind of shiny midrib or central vein. And sometimes you have to move the leaves in the sunlight to see that. Other plants that look similar will not have that. It's a very delicate kind of sprawling growth pattern. They can grow quite large, but the plants aren't very robust. So when they start to get, say 4 feet or taller, or even over 3 feet, they tend to have to lean and be propped up against other vegetation. If you pull a plant, its roots are not very much to look at. They're very easy to pull up, but they succeed by sheer numbers. Japanese stiltgrass flowers in late summer, kind of early fall sometimes. But the really tricky thing that makes it hard to manage is, in addition to the seed heads that are produced at the top of the plant, they produce a secondary flower at the base of the plant, right next to the ground, conveniently below the height of mower blades, which is one of the ways it makes it tricky to control. It is very shade tolerant, which is one of the reasons why we are concerned about it in woodlands. However, you'll notice that populations along trails or sunny edges tend to grow larger and mature earlier. So the only silver lining is that stiltgrass was a complete accidental introduction to North America. They suspect that it was likely introduced as packaging material in porcelain that was shipped from Asia, the dead grass with seeds in it, kind of packaging that stuff. So habitats and spread. I already mentioned that a large concern is its shade tolerance. However, we've been seeing stiltgrass invade a variety of habitats. So in southern Indiana, we first noticed it being spread on different sites via logging operations. So properties that had recently had a timber harvest, that was often the sites where it would pop up first. But now it is spread a variety of ways. Trails, obviously, but also waterways, mowing operations along trails and roads, but even lawns as well. I've had several, even residential properties where stiltgrass has popped up on the edge of a mowed lawn, and even spread throughout that lawn as well. The stiltgrass, because it can continue to produce seed beneath the height of that mower blade, can persist fairly well in mowed lawns. Infestations typically start on those property roads, trails, before moving more into interior forests. And part of that is how it's introduced, but also part of it is just those are the sunnier areas, and the stiltgrass plants there, kind of are the largest, densest populations, and they mature faster as well. So everything when it comes to managing stiltgrass comes down to its timeline. Because it is an annual, you have very specific times where you can control it in order to prevent seed production. And that is the only way that these populations can be managed, is if you consistently prevent seed production. So here in southern Indiana, to give you an example, for our timeline, in April is when you will start seeing plants germinate. This picture is actually from early May, showing the size of the stiltgrass plants then. And at this stage, they can be very hard to detect unless you have large patches. And those large patches actually will sometimes stand out, especially if you have higher, taller vegetation around them. And then suddenly you see an area where it looks like there's almost no vegetation. Everything is very low to the ground. And that's because of a large patch of stiltgrass. And of course, through summer, puts on growth and gets larger until, in our area, late August and early September is when I have first noticed plants flowering. And this image here shows what the tip of a plant will look like prior to flowering. It almost looks like a curled up leaf at the end of the stems, and that plant is preparing to flower. So that's kind of the warning sign that if you haven't controlled it yet, you need to quickly. And there is quite a bit of variability, even just locally between patches. How much sunlight, what are the conditions there? Not all the plants will flower at the same time. That is what a flowering stem looks like there. Not very showy at all. And that is what you might see on the edge of a trail, a patch that is in seed, kind of those seeds, stems up above the rest of the plants. And those seeds mature in September and October. Because it may not be obvious, when a plant is flowering versus when that seed has developed, I usually try to recommend folks complete their control work before flowering. And even in winter, large patches can be detected because they leave behind this dense thatch. And you can actually see here, this is along a trail side at Patoka Lake, where some of that dead thatch, that dead stiltgrass, is leaning up against some other shrubs, autumn olive shrubs actually in this case. And you can kind of see even in winter how those taller stems are laying up against something. This is also a concern for some folks, that this thatch can alter fire regimes as well. But really what we're paying attention to when it comes to management is that part of the timeline when plants are actually green and growing before they flower. And specifically, the magical part where most management occurs is right before flowering. And that is because we've found if you control it too early in spring or in summer, what can happen is you have a second round of germination. So you kill all those plants and then you have a bare spot and more seeds germinate. So you can't control it too early, or you run the risk of still having plants produce seed that year. So when it comes to controlling stiltgrass, you do have options, this is where things can start to get complicated, because the real option, the real struggle is finding those management options that work for your site. Mowing, as I mentioned, does not control stiltgrass, and often it contributes to its spread. If you have small areas, non-chemical options are completely viable. Hand pulling works. We've also found weed whacking with a string weed trimmer does work, but you have to do it at ground level, essentially like scraping that dirt with this with the string weed trimmer, and that will be effective. Burning, such as with a backpack torch, if you're not able to use herbicide in an area, that is also effective. And there's also lots of chemical options depending on your site and what other plants are in the area for what selectivity you're looking at. Pre-emergent or post-emergent options, either products with residual control or without. The real challenge is just making sure that whatever method you're using, your timing is correct. And this is where we get into the treatment timeline. So we have kind of our stiltgrass timeline there at the top, and kind of the first options here. If you choose to, you can use a pre-emergent herbicide, and that has to occur before germination because that product is designed to prevent germination. The next option, you can get away with using a post-emergent herbicide that has residual control. You know how I mentioned, most of our control happens, right before flowering? Well, if you have a product like this that has residual control, you can apply it earlier and it will prevent that second round of germination. If you use a product that does not have residual control, such as glyphosate, if you spray early, then you need to repeat it. So in reality, what normally happens is just that one treatment, towards the end of summer before flowering, which actually is right about now, July and early August for our area is when that ends up falling. Or if you're doing non-chemical control, pulling, weed whacking, burning, any of those pretty much follow similar timeline for using something like glyphosate, where if you do it super early in the year, then you're going to need to repeat it. The only benefit is it does have a longer window towards the end of the season, where unlike glyphosate, where it has to occur before flowering, if you're hand pulling, you can hand pull after plants are flowering, or even as seed is starting to be produced, as long as after you pull those plants, you bag them, similar to garlic mustard, to prevent seed dispersal. So when you are thinking about what control options you will choose, you really have to look at your site. So, what is the surrounding vegetation? Or, do you have these big solid dense patches of stiltgrass where if you're spraying, you're not likely to be hitting other plants? Or is it more interspersed with other vegetation? If you're treating around waterways, that's very important. Some of our chemical options do not come in aquatic safe formulations. Are you limited on time or labor? Some folks may prefer a non-chemical option, but that comes with a lot more labor that has to be invested. One of the things that I point out to my landowners, if they're trying to select what chemical they want to use, is it going to be difficult for them, in July, early August, to get out there during the treatment window? If they're very busy and they don't think they'll be able to get out there in time, or they're not sure, it might be worth it to invest in a more expensive herbicide product that will allow them to treat earlier. So those products that I mentioned, I am not overly familiar with pre-emergence, but from the resources that I have looked at, there are some pre-emergent only options. One of the products that I refer my landowners to that several of them use is Milestone, which is aminopyrrolid. That is one of the options that allows you to spray the stilt grass after it's emerged, but that will provide that residual activity to prevent a second round of germination during the growing season. Mazapir and Oust are two other products that also effectively do that. They're a little more suited for professional applicators. Milestone has the benefit that it is specific to broadleaf plants and annual grasses like stiltgrass, but will not harm perennial grasses. So, depending on where your plant's growing, can affect that. Herbicides with no residual activity tend to be cheaper. But again, you're more limited on your timing for it. Obviously, glyphosate is the one that we are most familiar with, but there are also two grass-specific options, clethodim and sethoxydim products. And so that can be beneficial if you have a lot of other broadleaf plants in there that you don't want to harm. Maybe you choose a grass-specific product. The other benefit with really all of these is stiltgrass is not an incredibly difficult plant to kill as an annual grass. So you can use much lower rates than you would for other plants. And actually with glyphosate, I have heard from folks that have experimented with really, really low rates. So I normally recommend 0.5% to 1% by volume of a 41% glyphosate mix for my landowners. However, I've heard folks use as little as 0.25% or even 1/8% of a glyphosate concentrate for their stiltgrass, with the idea that these very low rates, the surrounding perennial grasses, even if they are temporarily knocked back, will come back just fine from their roots, and they will not be permanently harmed from that herbicide application. Similar thing with using low rates of the grass-specific clethodim, sethoxydim. I always tell landowners, if that's the route that you're trying, test a small area first just to be sure. Don't go doing large broadcast spraying if that's what you were counting on without checking first. And of course, non-chemical is more labor, but that is really your only option late in the season. If you go out there and you find plants are already flowering, seeding, hand pulling and bagging is really the only option that you have. So I do have a handout if folks are interested that specifies all of these different rates. I have my contact information at the end. You can feel free to email me and I can send this to you. So I already mentioned, that stiltgrass requires much lower rates to kill. And, sometimes you can experiment with those ultra low rates. Keep in mind, though, how long it takes an herbicide to kill plants. Some of those very low rates can take a little bit longer. So if plants are already starting to flower, you might not want to, use those very low rates. One of the other things too that some managers are considering are if stiltgrass might eventually develop herbicide resistance. It's nothing that anyone has witnessed so far. However, as one of the few annual invasives that we have that we are using large amounts of herbicide on, it does run that risk. So some managers that are returning to sites year after year have chosen to switch up what herbicide they're using year to year, just to kind of avoid that becoming a potential problem. And I included a great photo here of one of the landowners that I've worked with in Daviess County, Margaret Allison, and she is standing in an area the first year post-treatment of using Milestone to control her stiltgrass. And we were so excited because we were looking around and we actually could not find stiltgrass coming back that following year. It's not gone from the site. She will have to return to it. But this showed that not only did Milestone provide that residual control the year it was applied to prevent, germination, but even the following year, which means even though it's a slightly more expensive product, she's getting a lot more, use out of that one application and a lot more continued control. So those seeds are still there. They will come back, but getting a longer control like that is fantastic. So a few other just kind of field observations on stiltgrass. I already mentioned seeds germinating, kind of following early control. I've seen different things when I've looked online about, how long the seed bank for stiltgrass stays viable. But for managers that I've talked to who have been managing stiltgrass for a while now, they estimate that the seed bank stays viable for 7 to 10 years. However, if you do have a truly new infestation that you start controlling right away, you may be able to eliminate it in just 1 or 2 treatments, indicating that a seed, big seed bank has not established itself yet. Established populations, those are the ones that are going to take 7 to 10 years. Growth can also vary greatly, with plants on those sunny areas growing bigger, maturing faster. And if they're mixed in with other vegetation that, maybe partially shades them, they may not emerge evenly then as well. Some of the managers, commonly were visiting sites multiple times per year and found patches that they hadn't noticed previously popping up later in the growing season. So that is something else to keep in mind. This picture here, you can kind of see, giant stiltgrass in an area where this landowner had just had a timber harvest. So it really opened it up, a lot of sun coming in here, but it's mixed in with a lot of other tall perennial grasses as well. So it's something where it probably was very easy to miss earlier in that growing season. Planning and prioritizing. This is something I've been stressing for a lot of my landowners to keep them from being overwhelmed. A full survey of your property is important. Examining where you have stiltgrass, where you don't have stiltgrass, and how it's being spread. Stop mowing your stiltgrass is most important. Stop making the problem worse, but also examining any creeks, waterways, roads, or trails. Cleaning equipment to prevent stiltgrass spread, not just around your property, but also particularly anywhere else off your property. And if you have too much stiltgrass to treat, be realistic in what areas you know that you can take on and you can treat year after year. Prioritize treating trails and roads, areas where you might pick up and move seed. Because then if you can eliminate seed production there, you're at least containing it more and reducing further spread. If you're treating multiple sites a year, schedule treatment of those open sunny sites first, since they will mature faster. And if there are any new infestations, small or isolated patches, those are definitely more valuable to treat than those widespread populations. Because that is how we will reduce the size of the overall population. And those new ones, you are actually able to hopefully eliminate and push back that spread. Those widespread populations, that's going to be a lot more difficult. So that's all I have for today. As I mentioned, my contact information is here on the slide. If you have any other questions, there are also some great resources online. I particularly love a handout that MC Iris put together. They're another SISMA in Indiana. And for landowners in Daviess, Dubois, or Martin counties, I can also conduct free site visits to your properties if you're trying to identify stiltgrass or any other invasive plants and need any guidance on how to control them. So, and if folks have any other experience controlling stiltgrass, that differs from what I've said here, feel free to contact me. I'd love to hear about it. So, best of luck, everyone.